Camera's not on. At least there's no lights on it. Mic is on, camera's not. Well, I'm sorry, this is taking longer than it should. And where is the on button for this thing? Okay, let's see. Webcam. Okay, now that I sent that message, I guess I need to say something so that you can tell me whether you can hear me or not. If you can hear me, this may be like a radio broadcast. You can just listen. But, okay, we're just going to go with that because I don't have the strength in me today to figure out why the webcam isn't working.
Is it with the connection right here? It looks really loose.
No, those are in as tight as they'll go. They are loose.
That's what we usually turn it on.
Yeah.
It's not just connected from down there.
Hey, that may have done it. Unplugging it and plugging it back in. No, there's still no lights on. Okay, we're just going to go with this. All right. Before we get started, I'm going to do this section 9 and 10 the same way we did 7 and 8. We're going to speed through them and then have a test. Is that all right? Okay. And on Friday, I need you to either bring a phone or a computer if you're in class, or have access to one other than the one that you're using to watch the live stream. We're going to do something fun on Friday. Just because you got to waste a little bit of time in life. Not all wasted time is wasted. Y'all will probably think it's wasted, but it'll be. Okay, so we're still talking about the same time period. The first 30 to 50 years of the 1800s, but let's talk about it more in the sense of how people were living. Than in political terms. I get tired of politics anyway. Because this is a time period where there is an immense amount of change. And we've hinted at this already, that cities are growing, commercialism is growing, markets are growing, and it is fundamentally changing the lifestyle of a lot of Americans. One of the biggest changes is agriculture. Now, we have been a predominantly rural, agricultural-based country since the beginning. The basis has always been agriculture. First, it was subsistence, and then it was local markets. Now it's getting beyond that. And the big boom came with cotton. And we've talked about cotton quite a bit. But there was a development really in the late 1700s, but by the time it kicked in, it was early 1800s, that makes cotton profitable. How many of you have ever seen cotton? You've seen it growing in the fields, obviously. Those little white puffy balls have a seed in them. And it's a stickery seed, and you have to pick the cotton off of that seed to make it into cloth. Well, that's expensive if you have to do it by hand, because you have to pay somebody to do that. Even if it's a slave, you bought them, you have paid. Before the cotton gin, one person could clear about 1 pound of cotton a day. So those big bales that you see out in the fields, those have thousands of pounds in them. So you're talking like a pile like this, maybe a pound. But a young man named Eli Whitney was visiting a plantation in Georgia. It was actually the widow of Nathaniel Greene from the Revolutionary fame. And as conversation often did, it turned to the problem of separating the seed from the fiber. Eli was a recent graduate, I think of Yale, and he came up with a gadget. The cotton engine, shortened to cotton gin, that would separate out the fibers. And by spring, his gadget was working. You could clear 50 pounds a day. So 5 times more than doing it by hand. Cotton is now much more profitable, and it is spreading through the South. And not only through the South, through the Old South, but through the New South as well. Mississippi and Alabama, into Texas eventually. Not yet, we're not there yet. But Mississippi and Alabama, probably a little bit into Tennessee, as people start moving west. Now, we did talk, cotton is very hard on the soil, but there's still enough new land that they're still able to spread out. This, of course, increased the use of slaves and the slave trade, which is not necessarily a good thing. But cotton becomes a major export. More than half of all exports from the United States were cotton from the mid-1830s to 1860. And not only did they export it overseas to Europe, but to the North, supplying the North with raw materials and markets. And this explosion in cotton allowed the North to build new factories and businesses. The other big agricultural change was in the West. We talked about planters and slaves moved into Alabama and Mississippi. The northern areas were fed more through the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes. No slaves going in the northern areas, but people are flooding west. And by 1860, over half of the population is going to live west of the Appalachian Mountains, which makes sense because over half of the available territory is west of the Appalachian Mountains. Lose my place. Land laws were making it easier. The land laws were changed in 1820, lowered the price of it. It lowers the price per acre, but it also changes the terms. So you could get a farm for as little as 100 down. And the state banks were offering such easy credit, it was easier to pay it off, or at least stay ahead of the loan. But there were pushes for more reduction. There was the Preemptive Act of 1830, which allowed for squatters to buy property at its lowest value once the area was surveyed. So if you got out ahead of the surveyors and picked you a spot, you could claim your 160-acre homestead at whatever the lowest land price at that time was. It took a little, no, it wasn't, hang on, they did have it was $1.25 an acre, sorry. I was thinking it was the lowest price. It's not, it's $1.25 an acre. They kept pushing, and they got the Graduation Act passed in 1854. That act allows unsold tracts to be lowered in price gradually over 30 years. So, you know, if you have that one section, or these are actually quarter section that has, you know, nothing but canyons and straight bluffs, no one's going to buy it to farm. Eventually, it will get cheap enough where somebody would afford it. You still had the same pattern. You know, you still have to go in, cut down the trees, root out the stumps, clear the land. But during this early 30s period, you get a rush of new equipment that makes it easier. In 1819, Jethro Wood of New York created a plow with replaceable parts. You know, so if you break one, you can replace it instead of buying a whole new plow. John Deere introduced the steel plow in 1837. James Oliver improved on that with a chilled iron and steel plow. By the 1840s, mechanical seeders had been introduced, so you didn't have to walk the rows and plant each seed, which you really didn't do anyway. I mean, they just kind of scattered it, unless you were like really OCD. In 1831, Cyrus McCormick of Virginia invented a mechanical reaper that increased the workload by about 24 times. One man with a sickle could clear a half an acre a day of wheat. Y'all know what a sickle is, right? The thing the Grim Reaper carries. 2 men with a reaper could clear 12 acres a day. That's a big increase. And when you can clear more and plant easier, natural instinct is to plant more because you can work it easy, you can work it better. And by the 1850s, farming was no longer a subsistence or a local market activity. It was a commercial activity. Wheat is being exported overseas. It's also being sent eastward. And all of these changes are changing our work schedule, our workload, and how people look at their day and their workload. Along with all of these changes were transportation changes. That in 1795, Daniel Boone had pretty much opened up Kentucky through the Wilderness Road. It's widened to allow stagecoach traffic. In the Northeast, they're starting to build turnpikes. Turnpikes were toll roads in a sense. You actually had a pipe on a turnstile that you can open and close the road with. The Philadelphia Lancaster Turnpike was the first one done, finished in 1794. It was macadamized. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. It's basically it's not pavement, but it's not quite caliche either. It's a finished surface. Those types of roads are very popular in the north, in the northeast. In the south and in the west, it was pretty much whatever you could, forge through the wilderness. But by 1821, there are around 4,000 miles of turnpikes completed. And this is important, not just because this isn't the only, you start that whole sentence over. Wider roads, better able to travel roads, added to the invention of the stagecoach. People had wagons before stagecoaches. The stagecoaches make their appearance now, where you have, in essence, public transportation. It's privately owned, but you can buy a ticket, get on the stage. Stagecoaches could travel about 4 miles an hour, which is a heck of a lot faster than you can walk. And with these new roads, you could actually get places if you rode a stagecoach. Water transportation. Water transportation takes on a huge importance during this time. It has always been important. People try to settle near waterways, navigable waterways. We've talked about that. But now we're going to start making our own waterways. By the 1820s, steamboats, flatboats, canal barges were all moving up and down the available rivers. Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston were the first. They invent the steamboat and they send it up the Hudson in 1807. Steamboats are going to transform river travel. Prior to the steamboat, if you were, say, in St. Louis and you had a load of corn and you need to get it down to New Orleans to sell it, you would put it on a flatboat. A flatboat is essentially a raft. And it's got a big rudder. So somebody stands on the raft with the rudder. You probably have 3 or 4 guys on this raft. One will work the rudder. The others have poles that you can push down into the sand. If you can't get into the current, you push it down into the mud and push the thing along. So you get your corn down to New Orleans. Now what? Can you take your flatboat back upstream? Probably not. Usually they were just chopped up for firewood when you got down to New Orleans. Steamboats, however, can go both ways. You can steam up the river. The steamboat is strong enough to fight the current. And it makes it a lot faster. A flatboat from Pittsburgh to New Orleans would take up to 6 weeks. A steamboat could do it in 25 days, which still, in our terms, seems like a very long time. But life is speeding up now. It's starting to speed up. By 1836, there were over 300 steamboats in use. Now, not only are the steamboats bringing things downstream, they're loading up market goods and taking them upstream. So these areas that are isolated are able to get market goods that they wouldn't normally get. And trading points will spring up along the rivers. Flatboats still carry the bulk, which would be wheat, corn, flour, bacon, ham, whiskey, candles, soap, lead, copper, timber, iron. All of these things were produced in these western towns or areas, and now they're getting a return for their trade. The Erie Canal, and I'm going to put a video, if I can find it, on Blackboard for y'all to watch on the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal was extremely important. It's going to tie the west to the east. So the Erie Canal is going to connect Lake Erie to New York City. So it's going to tie the port of New York into the Great Lakes. Because if you can get in Lake Erie, you can get in the other lakes. The effect is that it's going to isolate the South by tying the West, at least the upper Northwest, to New York City. It is the idea of Governor DeWitt Clinton. He gets permission from the New York legislature. They start this in 1817, and by 1825, it's complete. 40 feet wide, 4 foot deep, and 363 miles long. A man-made river. And it immediately takes off. It reduces travel time from New York City to Buffalo from 20 days to 6. And freight costs on that same trip go down from $100 to $5, which makes it much more profitable if you're the one sending the freight. And New York is going to explode with this. New York is going to become our greatest port. There were around 3,000 miles of waterways built before 1837. The Panic of 1837 is what's going to end the Great Canal building. That and railroads. Railroads were, the first railroad was built in 1825 in England. And the Americans took notice. And Americans in the biggest cities, Baltimore, Boston, were looking, where did my notes go? I turned the page before I should. Baltimore, Charleston, Boston, New York, all come up with schemes to tie the center of the country in with the rest of the world. And these port cities, it's important because if you can get people to come to your port city, then your port becomes more important. Just like New York has with the Erie Canal. By 1840s, there's over 30,000 miles of track. People love the whole idea of a railroad. And railroads have a lot of advantages. Railroads traveled an average of 10 miles an hour. That's way faster than that stagecoach. And you got more room. You can put a lot more people on a railroad, in a rail car than you can in a stage. They also had, they had bigger carrying capacity, not just for people, but also for goods. And they were reliable. You know, if you had a morning like today and like tomorrow is supposed to be, you're not going to want to be on a stage. It's going to get mucked down in the mud. Railroads, it didn't matter. The weather was not an issue. So they were more reliable, and they pretty much surpassed any other land transportation system. They also encouraged new settlement and farming. because you no longer had to be near a waterway. Railroads were going everywhere. You just had to get close. They demanded iron, and other expertise, which created more business on that end. The downside was it further corrupted political life. It accelerated the decline of the Indians as the West fills up faster. And essentially, it sped up life. Watches become an issue with railroads, and railroads are going to spur the time zones. We didn't have time zones before railroads. The last transportation I want to talk about is the clipper ships. And you've all seen the clipper ships with the big sails. And this is a very short-lived, kind of romantic, but issue. Clipper ships were fast. They had the speed due to all the sails. No one had really yet tried steam engines out on the ocean. So you're still sailing under wind power. And the big pull was Chinese tea. Tea has a very short shelf life. It actually has a long shelf life, but it's best. Chinese tea is best if it's harvested and processed quickly. Clipper ships could make that trip much quicker than any merchant ships. And then you're going to add the gold rush. And we haven't talked about that yet, but we will. When the gold rush hits, people are so desperate to get around to the other side of the country, clipper ships are the answer, or at least the answer if you had enough money. The downside is clipper ships didn't have a lot of space for cargo. Have any of y'all ever been to Galveston to the big tall ship? You have? What struck you the most about that ship? For me, it was not how big it was how small it was. I mean, it's a big ship, but that and the fact with the part about the banana spiders, that kind of creeped me out. But this room probably has like the max amount of storage you could put on that ship. Would you agree?
Oh,
yeah. I mean, that's not a lot of stuff if you're taking a ship. I mean, if that's your job is to transport goods, you don't have a lot of room. But the clipper ships will give way to steamships as steamships start plying the ocean. Now, the government had a limited role. We've talked about this again and again and again, that there were constitutional qualms, but state state governments and private firms didn't have these problems. So most were overtly financed by state and private. The federal government helped by supporting turnpikes and canals. They gave away land grants. They gave away tax incentives. They provide engineers for the railroads. West Point was still the best engineering school. And in 1850, they supported the Chicago to Mobile Railroad, which sets a precedent for federal involvement. It was supposed to be a one-time shot, but once you do it, it's out there. They did it once, they could do it again. Technology is another area of change. And all of these changes are speeding up our lives. You know, not to the point where we are now where you have instantaneous communication, but you're about to. But it's getting a lot faster. Americans were known for practical inventions, and they love gadgets. If you look at old catalogs, if you look at the patent office, there's hundreds of thousands of patents for things as practical as toilet paper holders to, the electromagnetic engine. Joseph Henry, who is American, did a lot of research into electromagnetism. His work helped Samuel Morse build the telegraph. He designed that in 1832. In 1844, the first intercity telegraph message was sent. It takes some time to lay lines because you have to have an actual physical connection. But now you can send a message within minutes that normally would take weeks. When Washington died, it took 12 days before they knew in New York, before it ran in the New York papers. Once the telegraph is set, it just becomes minutes. And once the first telegraph was sent, everybody else wanted one too. So you're starting to tie all the big cities together. In 1846, Henry becomes the head of the new Smithsonian Institute, which was the behest of an Englishman named James Smithson for the increased diffusion of knowledge. 2 years later, the American Association for the Advancement of Science is founded, and it is to advance science and serve society. Americans liked inventing. They liked creating things. This goes back to our colonial days. And they did this in practical ways that actually improved living. Houses could be bigger, better heated, better illuminated. Of course, you had to be able to afford that. But even the poor were getting better off. The affluent had indoor plumbing, central heating, gas lighting, bathtubs, ice boxes. Refrigeration will come next, but right now it's just ice boxes. But even the poor could afford coal-burning cast iron stoves, which still sounds like a lot of work, but at least you're not chopping wood. It's a lot easier. Sewer systems, water lines, and hydrants were beginning to be laid in cities, which is the sewer systems is a biggie. Because previous to this, the streets were the sewer system. People just threw their slops out the window. And cities were nasty, stinky things. They're still nasty, stinky things, but they're getting better. Water lines allowed people to have water in their homes. It also allowed for hydrants. So firemen didn't have to rely on bucket brigades to put out fires. And fires were very common. In San Angelo, as soon as the weather turned cold, somebody's house was burning down. Because you're creating heat in your home, usually in early San Angelo by means of either coal or wood, and houses burn. It happens now. If you notice when the cold weather really starts hitting, that's where we're going to have more house fires. All these factories that are processing the cotton are creating fabric that are being machine made into clothes. There is a human factor in this, but ready-made clothes become available, which were usually better made and better fitting than homemade. Newspapers and magazines proliferate. We've already talked about clocks and watches because now time matters. If you're on a farm, you just get up and you do your chores. It doesn't matter, when the sun is up overhead, you go have lunch. People didn't have to watch the time. But if you're a wage laborer and you have to be at work at 7 o'clock, you need something to tell you when 7 o'clock is. If you're a railroad or a railroad engineer and you're supposed to be in a certain station, or if you're somebody catching a train at a certain station, you need to know what time it is. Time is now important. Where before it was not what ran your day. Now it has becoming one of those things that runs the day. I put Charles Goodyear, he vulcanizes rubber, which makes it more pliable, makes it last a little longer. Elias Howe creates the sewing machine, which actually is a setback for the factories because people can do piecework from home instead of going into a factory, but it'll balance out. It's improved on by Singer. That's where most people know the sewing machine. And then, of course, we have an Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution starts in England with the advent of the steam engine in 1705. And they guard their secret quite well. If you were an engineer, if you were a mechanic, you were not allowed to immigrate. England worked really hard to keep the secret of the steam engine in England. And they managed to do so until about 1789. It's improved on vastly in 1765 by James Watt. But in 1789, it comes across the ocean when Samuel Slater arrived in America with the knowledge of how to build a water-powered spinning machine. Now, the spinning machine is what actually takes your fibers and spins it into yarn. He convinces an investor to go in with him. That should be 1790, not 1890. They built a factory in Rhode Island, and it takes off. He has 7 kids producing miles and miles of yarn a day that is then sent out to be woven. The 1807 embargo is going to help the system. And by 1815, mills numbered in the hundreds. Now, factories have some not unintended consequences, but but things that do happen because of them. Factories need workers. Slater's first factory hired children. So you're going to see in these factories groups that normally would not be working outside of the home other than in a farming situation, working outside of the home. Children go to work, women go to work, whole families go to work. And now they're reliant on their employer for a paycheck. Yes, you're working, it's your labor, but you're tied into a system now. And there were a few, when it first starts, there's a few people who go at it kind of the right attitude. In Waltham, Mississippi, in 1813, the Boston Manufacturing Company decides to build factories to make the raw material, that yarn, into finished cloth. They pick the Merrimack River, name the city Lowell after Francis Cabot Lowell, who was one of the associates, and they start building. They not only build a factory, but they build a town to go with it, where the factory workers can live, because you want your workers nearby. And they encourage young women to come and work. One, women had a little more dexterity and were able, usually are smaller, able to work around the machines a little bit better. They would also take less pay than men. The first Lowell factory, in order to assure the parents of these girls that they would be taken care of, the houses had headmistresses that made sure the girls went to church. There were they had time to like publish a newspaper, go to school. It was very moral, very cared for, very regimented. They weren't just going to a big city and running them up. But that's going to change over time because more and more factories are getting built. The makeup of the girls is going to change. Early on, it was mostly young farm girls from the New England towns, but it's pretty much going to be fed by the Irish. And prejudice against the Irish in the early 1800s was very high. Also, the opinion of their morality was very low. So, yeah, we can slack off and not take as good a care of these girls as we would of the New England girls. That's one system, the Lowell system. And we'll talk about, well, we'll do the Rhode Island, well, yeah, we'll talk about the Rhode Island system when we come back because we're out of time and I'm almost out of air. I was hoping we could get through this.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank y'all for coming. I know it was probably hard to make a decision to get up and get out
It
today.
was. Have a nice day.
Thanks.